Welcome to Climate Change and Health in Small Island Developing States focused on the Caribbean. If you require translation into Spanish or French, please use the link posted in the chat and choose your desired language at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You should continue to keep this browser open as well to utilize the chat and Q&A features. Please be sure to scroll down and mute the video. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for the panelists. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on communicating to the Caribbean community about climate change and health. We've got a really exciting lineup of speakers here today that will look at a variety of different facets of this issue, including looking at Caribbean public perception data on climate change and health, as well as how sports, media, and other communications can help to mainstream climate action in society. So my name is John Kocher. I'm a professor of George Mason at George Mason University, where I study climate change communication. I'll begin by introducing each of our speakers. They'll have a few moments to give some opening remarks, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So our first speaker will be Dr. Jonathan Drury. Jonathan is a regional climate change and health advisor with the Pan American Health Organization based in Barbados. In this position, he provides technical cooperation in the areas of climate change and health and the environmental determinants of health. He is also the project manager for the implementation of the EU CARIFORUM Strengthening Climate Resilient Health Systems in the Caribbean project. The focus of his talk will be on public perceptions of climate change and health in the Caribbean. Then we'll have Daphne Ewing Chow. She's a well-known and widely published Caribbean journalist, an active contributor to a wide number of global publications, including the New York Times, the Sunday Times of London, and the International Monetary Fund. Daphne is perhaps best known for her work as a senior contributor with Forbes, covering issues pertaining to sustainability. The title of her talk will be on media coverage of climate change and health, perspectives from the Caribbean. Then we'll hear from Lisa Bailey. Lisa is currently working as the Communications and Visibility Coordinator for a 5-year EU-funded climate change and health action for 16 CARIFORUM countries. She's also been a member of the National Chronic Disease Commission and the National Task Force on Physical Activity. In 2019, she was seconded to the PAHO WHO Office of Sub-Regional Program Coordination in the Caribbean as an international PAHO consultant. The title of her talk is Communicating Climate Change and Health, PAHO EU CARIFORUM Climate Change and Health Project. Then finally, I'm excited to have Derek Murray here. Derek is a former West Indies cricketer, and he was the vice captain of the West Indies teams that won the 1975 and the 1979 Cricket World Cups. He also served as a diplomat in the Foreign Service of Trinidad and Tobago from 1978 to 1989. Then he worked in the financial services industry in the United Kingdom, as well as in Trinidad and Tobago. Derek Murray was also recently appointed as Trinidad and Tobago's High Commissioner to Jamaica and is the current chairman of the Commonwealth Advisory Body on Sport. The title of his presentation is Sports as an Influencer of Climate Change and Health in the Caribbean. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker. Jonathan, go ahead and take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all and have an opportunity to present a little bit about this research that has been done as part of the EU CARIFORUM Strengthening Climate Resilient Health Systems project. So I'm going to share with you today some of the preliminary findings from this survey that was done at the end of last year into 2021. And really, the main purpose of this is really the need for a high priority for the area of, in the research agenda, really to understand knowledge, attitudes, and practices to engage the public in the Caribbean. And so I would like to recognize UWI for their work on this, particularly Marcia Ivy, Stacey Adams, Chris Ora, and Lisa Bailey from PAHO. And I think from one of the previous speakers, Jared Granado, in his words, this is really a people-oriented movement, or it's no movement at all. So I think we really need to understand more about the public. Next slide, please. So really the rationale for this survey was to get a better understanding of the public perceptions for a number of Caribbean countries in order to orient this project's communication and visibility plan. The project has a number of partners that we work with across the Caribbean. We also wanted to establish a baseline on public awareness and perceptions and where people get their sources of information for the project. This was a convenient sample, so there certainly are some limitations, but we really wanted to, really for one of the first times, to address this issue of public perceptions across a wide array of countries, and then share and communicate the findings with the larger community to promote this type of research. This type of research has been done in a number of countries in the past and with healthcare providers, but nothing really on this scale. Next slide, please. So the methods, this was a survey instrument that we designed with George Mason, with John and others, and to target really 3,000 respondents from 10 countries. So the instrument we developed was based upon other instruments that have been used globally for comparison, but also to then pilot and modify the questions for the Caribbean. So it contained 22 questions. We used Digicel Media text messages through cell phones to get the responses through a convenient sample. And we promoted the survey actively through social media. Next slide, please. So as you can see, as far as the demographics, the distribution was not exactly what we expected. Our goal was to cut across all 10 countries and get relatively even distributions of respondents from each. But in the end, the first three, you see Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Barbados, made up about 50% of the respondents. As far as other demographics, there were more females. We covered primary, secondary, undergraduate, postgraduate pretty well. A higher educated population, I would say. The demographics were across the board, would have liked perhaps some older, more than 74. And then the geographic spread was pretty even across what were listed as suburban, rural, and urban. Next slide, please. So importance of climate change to respondents, almost 75% considered climate change to be either extremely or very important. Next slide, please. Then this slide you can appreciate from the first three areas that really approximately 95% believe that climate change is at least in part or entirely caused by human activities. Next slide, please. What about knowledge about causes and effects of climate change on health? Well, more than 80% of participants reported being moderately to extremely knowledgeable about the causes and effects of climate change on health. Next slide. What about impact from climate change on health? So about 75% thought that climate change affected health a moderate amount to a great deal. Next slide, please. And here you can see from the different categories that really almost 75% moderately to extremely knowledgeable about the physical effects from climate change, but less so when it comes to the mental health impacts. Next slide. Belief that climate change impacted specific areas. Well, here more people responded yes to either direct or more obvious impacts, so such as extreme weather events and extreme heat, air pollution, mosquitoes. Next slide, please. Belief that certain groups are more likely to experience health problems related to climate change, getting at vulnerable populations and how people perceive them. Well, as you can see, about half thought that people with pre-existing health conditions would be more likely to experience health problems, and children at about 40%. And then these other categories were quite a bit lower. Next slide, please. Trusted sources, Ministry of Health officials, local doctors were at the top, less so social media and websites. Next slide, please. And then perceived effort countries should make to protect people from the harmful effects of climate change. So of the 3,000, 84% said it should be a large-scale effort. Next slide, please. And then finally, some key findings. Well, majority of respondents, about 90%, really recognized the human contribution and degree of urgency. Granted, it's likely that many of the people that completed the survey had an interest in climate and health. So that does give us the motivation for action. Also, there was a connection made by many, about 75%, with the physical and lesser degree with the mental health. So more connection with the direct and visible impacts. That tells us really there's a need to promote more of these environmental determinants of health and non-communicable diseases, especially mental health. Fewer recognize climate as adversely affecting the disabled, the indigenous, and immigrants. That implies need for tools like vulnerable and adaptation assessments that can help countries to determine who are the most vulnerable and communicate that to the population. Lower awareness of national action, really less than 44% of respondents knew of anything going on to advance research and practice. So at the national level. So we really need to communicate that message. 84% support a high level of national engagement. That's again, really a call for action for the work that we're doing and for everything that's being done on this conference this week. TV, radio, and Facebook were the leading preferences for communication. There was a low preference, about 60% that had seen one story on climate and health over the past year, which really gets at the need for us to push towards training of communicators and journalists that we'll hear about in the next sessions. Also, leading trusted sources were doctors, nurses, TV, news, and radio. That in part supports our continued training of healthcare providers, like Dr. Kocher presented yesterday, of how important that is to work with that population in the Caribbean. And so with that, I will end. Thank you all for this time and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Jonathan, for all of that wonderful data. As a social scientist, I really appreciate seeing all of those numbers and getting a better understanding of public perceptions in the Caribbean region. Next, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Daphne. We have Daphne Ewing Chow next.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just getting my slides up here. So today I want to talk to you about media coverage of climate change and health in the Caribbean. Just by way of background, just to let everybody know, I head up content at Loop Cayman, which is a regional media company, and actually the only media company in the region that has dedicated full-time news desks within all of the major markets of the Caribbean. And this has actually proved to be highly beneficial to the rest of my presentation, as you all will see, because I've been able to gather analytics about regional interests in climate change and health. I also am able to have a global perspective, as I am an environmental journalist with Forbes as well. So just to get started, I feel like there needs to be a more coordinated effort among media professionals to get the word out there about climate change and health. As Jonathan's presentation just showed, there is not enough in the area of print around communication with regards to climate change and health. So in 2019, I actually interviewed Inger Anderson, who is the head of the United Nations Environment Program. And she said, time is running out for us to act in a coordinated manner to prevent a looming environmental, economic, and humanitarian catastrophe. So how can we be more organized about this? And by the way, I do focus a little bit more heavily on print in this presentation, just because that's the type of journalism that I'm most involved in. So this was a bit of a mental dump for me. This is the way I see the role of the media. Obviously, all of our information with regards to climate change and health starts with the scientists. My role as a media professional is to be neutral and objective while still engaged in advocacy. And the way to be engaged in advocacy as a media professional is to convey the truth, basically. The facts and the statistics speak for themselves. And my role as a media professional is to convey that information in a digestible and relatable way to the public. And when I say the public, I'm referring to civil society, policymakers, politicians, who come into this arena with their own vested interests, their own ability to process the information, and of course, their own belief systems that are based on a variety of factors within their lives. And it's my role to break it down in a way that everybody can relate. And hopefully, then this will result in some degree of action and change in behavior, and also where members of the public will influence one another to take part in these actions. But here's where the disconnect lies. Within the region, as John's presentation would have showed, there is somewhat of a disconnect in articles that connect the issue of health to the issue of climate change. So where there are a lot of people that understand to some extent, you know, the what climate change is, and they understand that there is a connection between climate change and health. The mass print media especially is not really a place where they go for the majority of their information. So based on the survey that was conducted by Jonathan's team, only 29% of respondents actually go to newspapers for a great deal of their information pertaining to climate change and health. And as Jonathan mentioned, only 61% had even seen an article that connected climate change and health. So as an industry, we absolutely have to do better within the region. Here are some thoughts on why this connection is not being made. So as media professionals, we tend to connect the interests of our readers to the content that we produce. And where the statistics that I'm about to show you will show that as a region, we are incredibly interested in our health. The interest actually that I've noticed by looking at Loop Analytics across the region actually shows that the interest in climate change is significantly less than the interest in health, which obviously then results in fewer articles about the two topics. Secondly, the media has not connected these issues effectively. And I would say, as Jonathan mentioned, that more training needs to be done because there's also limited knowledge around these issues. So here's where everyone who's watching gets a little bit of a treat, because I think I'm in this unique position where I can look at every single market, or the main markets, I should say, in this presentation, although we do exist in most of the markets, to show what the interest is in these topics. So health is one of the most popular topics within the region, and so much content is consumed in this area. Across Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Cayman, 15,300 health-related articles were produced within the past year. And I'm talking about October 2020 to October 2021. And these were read almost 19 million times across the region. For every single market, except for Trinidad, health was the third most popular topic, where with regards to Trinidad, it was the most popular topic. So we're definitely not lacking for an interest in health-related issues within the region. Now, climate change is when things start getting complicated because the interests are actually not homogeneous. And I feel like I just don't have enough time to go through each market, but I'm going to just show you quickly. So in Jamaica, for example, the issue of climate change, and I picked 4 topics that I felt like would have some traction within the region. In Jamaica, climate change was the least popular. People were spending about 30 seconds on a climate change article, with each article getting about 645 views on average when it goes up. And the most popular climate change article in Jamaica when it went up was an article about a hurricane. In Trinidad, climate change is also the least popular topic, and Articles pertaining specifically to Trinidad were the most popular. Barbados, there seemed to be more of a diverse interest in the area of climate change. And in Cayman, it seemed to be more of an academic interest. And I'm going to actually attribute that to the fact that I'm an environmental writer and I'm responsible for the content that goes out on Luke Cayman. So I think that's why you see a little bit of more of an academic interest here among the readers. So what can we gather from these numbers? Well, first of all, messaging from our regional media people is important. Let's frame the story from the perspective of health as opposed to from primarily the perspective of climate change. Let's start with the health and let's take it down to climate change so that people will be locked into our stories. Let's connect with human emotions. And I'm sure this is something Lisa will speak to because we did a project together where we were speaking to different organizations within the region about doing human interest stories around climate change and health. Localize the issues, talk about our regional context, and emphasize the immediate health benefits, the win-wins. If I walk to where I'm going as opposed to driving, I will have a positive impact on my health and a positive impact on climate. And these were some winners within the region. I know I'm
Daphne,
going over.
If you could just wrap up here in the next few minutes.
Yes, so I just wanted to say that my favorite article and the #1 winner was an article that came out of our training program called When is Too Much Enough? How Climate Change Impacts, How Natural Disasters Affect Our Psyche. And that was produced by the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. And it's just a fabulous article. So thank you all very much. I hope that this was some food for thought. And if you want to connect with me further after the questions and answers, here are all of my handles. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Daphne. I really appreciate seeing that really granular set of data on sort of interest and traffic to different types of climate change and health news stories. Now I'll turn it over to Lisa Bailey. Lisa, take it away.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just make sure I'm on full screen. And I believe that I will be pretty good to follow Daphne because we did work together, as you heard, on some human interest stories, and we're very like-minded, to be honest. So as you heard, we'll be talking about communicating climate change and health in the Caribbean. And this is really from the perspective of the project that we're working on, but there are also some thoughts on just communicating climate change in this region as it relates to health as well. So I think, and I've learned so much from being a part of this conference, and I think we can say in the Caribbean that audiences in the Caribbean and other developing countries generally don't need to be convinced that climate change is happening. They can see the evidence right before their eyes. I mean, we recognize that it's hotter. We recognize it's hotter even at night. We have failing, sometimes flooded crops and inundated coastal zones, and you can see where that quote came from. So what these audiences need is to make sense of what they're seeing, to understand their lived experience, but in a scientific context, to know what the future climate might hold, and to decide what they should do about it. And I really enjoyed Dr. Taylor's talk on the first day because it really hit on just that. They need to understand it, they need to acknowledge that it affects them, and then to take action. So this calls for a new approach. I mean, you heard from Jonathan, you heard from Daphne as well. We can't do the same thing and expect a different result. So a new approach is needed. And to me, that means appealing to shared concerns. So that's activities and behaviors that provide opportunities for families to come together and do something about this problem, to engage people who are not already sympathetic about the cause, but to emphasize simplicity. Listen to people's concerns. And you heard about the perception survey. I felt it was very important that we did that because we can't continue to just, throw information at people and hope it will stick or it will make them change their behavior without finding out where they are and where they're coming from. I've also learned by doing my reading around this area to avoid criticizing capitalism and corporate greed because that immediately will raise some person's defenses. to focus on emotions and not so much the science. Yes, we use the science as a basis, but don't focus so much on that. So even in terms of adaptation and mitigation, say we're talking renewable energy, we talk about why it's not just good for the environment, but it's good for our health and good for our children and our future. And then specifically for the youth, there has been some research done in the Caribbean, and this came out of talks we've had and papers that UNICEF have done. And young people are very concerned about climate change and health, but they're also concerned about other things like access to jobs, education, cost of living, increasing crime and violence. And they have recognized a need for more awareness and education, both formal and informal. And they do see the linkages between climate change and lifestyles. So there's several communication tools that we can use. You've seen the ones that resonate in the Caribbean. We will try to use most of them. Here's that human interest story again. Very proud of that. And thank you so much to Daphne for helping us with that. So we will use traditional and digital communication, but we have to go beyond information and education to more social marketing and behavior change communication, where we identify behaviors that we want to change, and the survey will help us to do that. So we've started to create some communication products. These were done before the survey, so they're not behavior change communication products. They are more information-led products. And you will see more products coming out as this survey is launched. I saw a question there, and the survey will be launched soon and will be used to create other products. But we also see the need for social influencers and allies to use storytelling about climate change and health, and to strengthen advocacy through training of trainers. So I brought some of the products to share with you. We have a jingle, and I'm going to play that for you now. And I put some pictures to it so it wouldn't be difficult to just listen.
The climate's changing, so it's time to come together. Our health and the health of the earth, they're bound to one another. It's the clean water that we drink every day. The food we grow, the homes we know, it's where our children play. Our Caribbean nation's warm, with more droughts, floods, and storms. We have to take action to make it right. So let's prepare ourselves. Protect our health, and we can make our future bright. We want to make that future bright. Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean. Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean. The environment is changing, take the lead and change now. Educate yourself, all the things that you can do. Climate change affects the health, but action is the key. In every Caribbean, there's a room for you right here. Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean. The climate's changing.
So that's the jingle. Here we have 3 videos to share with you, and then some social media.
Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean.
Heat waves, flooding, stronger, more unpredictable storms are impacting our health and well-being. The impact of the environment on our health is a real challenge. The latest and most pressing of which is COVID-19.
Well, last year we had a fair amount of rain, but a couple of years back, right? 3, 4, 5 years back, we had very little rainfall. Yeah, the hurricanes, they are more destructive now. We had a severe, several flooding this year. The farmers lose the crops because the water was so high. When it falls, it rises up so high, so fast. And that everything you had usually was submerged underwater.
These changes threaten our temperature, our water and air quality, our ability to control mosquito-borne diseases, our food supply, our way of life.
Addressing climate change should be everyone's concern. So we are uniting and empowering Caribbean action on climate and health to create a healthier Caribbean climate.
It's not too late. Let's protect our environment and take action now. We are depending on you.
Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean.
An initiative of the Pan American Health Organization, CARIFORUM, and the European Union.
Take action for...
Here's your second video.
Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean.
Small and vulnerable states like here in the Caribbean are on the front lines of a changing climate.
If do not take action now, the impact on our health and livelihood will get worse.
Funded by the European Union, the Pan American Health Organization is partnering with several regional agencies to strengthen climate and health systems and promote leadership in 16 Caribbean countries. The goal? To increase capacity to adapt to and reduce the effects of climate change on health.
Together, we are empowering Caribbean action on climate and health.
Let's create a healthier Caribbean climate for you and me.
Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean.
An initiative of the Pan American Health Organization, CARIFORUM, and the European Union.
Take action for.
And I have one more video for you. This is on the interconnection between climate and health on dengue.
Climate change is one of the greatest threats to global health. It affects human health in many ways. Extreme weather can cause injury and even death. Floods can trigger waterborne diseases like gastroenteritis, and higher temperatures can cause mosquitoes that carry Zika, chikungunya, and dengue to breed faster and increase disease spread.
Dengue is a leading cause of sickness and hospitalization, and it can be fatal. So it's very important that we understand how climate change is increasing mosquito-borne diseases.
As part of the EU-funded project, Strengthening Climate Resilient Health Systems in the Caribbean, organizations are teaming up to better understand the links between climate conditions and these outbreaks. They're developing early warning systems to predict future outbreaks so we can be better prepared.
We can also play our part by reducing the presence of mosquitoes by taking care of our surroundings and protecting ourselves from mosquito bites.
We all have a role to play in the reduction of dengue cases.
Take action for climate and health. Let's empower the Caribbean.
Climate change is one of the.
And as I told you, we have our human interest stories. One has been shared so far. Thank you so much to Daphne for helping with that. It's all about storytelling. It's the best way to tell stories. We all love a good story. And we have 2 more in the works that should be shared really, really soon. And we've created some social media cards, well, some graphics that will be used very soon in a dissemination campaign. So you have a sneak peek here on the main outputs of the project. So here you can see those, and all of these will also have some text with them to explain.
Lisa, I'm so sorry if you can wrap up soon. Thank you.
And this is the end. Here's the last card. Thank you so much. We'll be sharing these cards with you really soon. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think I'm going to have that little jingle stuck in my head for the next few weeks here. Very catchy. All right, so I'd like to move on to our final speaker, Derek Murray. Derek, take it away.
Thank you very much to the organizers, especially Dr. James Hospitalis, for inviting me to this important conference. It was late 1975, on arriving in Australia for the first time with the West Indies cricket team, that I heard conversations, peripheral conversations, that, and I quote, there was a hole in the ozone layer over Australia. That went straight over my head. And it wasn't until later in that tour towards the end in February 1976 that we experienced one day's play in the very hot sun, temperatures above 40 degrees centigrade, followed the next day when again we had to labor throughout fielding in a test match under 13 degrees centigrade. Those extremes felt very much like the Sahara on one day and the tundra on another day. It really was very fascinating to experience this. But again, there was no significant thought until on subsequent tours and in later years, conversing with those colleagues from those days, that they had discovered skin cancers and they were being told about the need for greater protection from the elements, etc. Fast forward to 2021, August 2021, West Indies versus Pakistan playing test matches in Jamaica, conditions which our players are used to. But on separate occasions, at least two players were taken off the field, suffering from dehydration, obviously in great distress. But at about the same time, we were reading of examples or hearing of examples in other major tournaments, in football, golf, etc., and more recently in the US Open tennis, seeing it live. The effects of climate change are further noted in the central theme of the statements of most of the Caribbean nations at the current United Nations General Assembly. And that theme was on the lines that the scientific evidence is irrefutable that human-induced climate change threatens the very survival of humankind. Greenhouse gas emissions are at record levels, and the devastating effects of climate change continue to impact disproportionately on the small island developing states like us in the Caribbean. We, even more than others, need the full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. While this conference and the participants may fully understand the implications of all the figures that we are seeing over the last few days, and certainly looking at the presentations that we have had, and they may understand this. But what about the ordinary folk like myself in the Caribbean, who may think of these utterings of the mad scientists or the mad technicians and experts who are trying to guide us through, while we are also being affected by the recent, or the current pandemic, I should say, but also by our own the effects of our own non-communicable diseases. Obesity, particularly in children, is worrying. Diabetes, heart disease, coronary things, the impact of Sahara dust, whatever else we want to call it, on our respiratory ailments. We need, however, while realizing the seriousness of those things, we need to be able to communicate it to the ordinary citizens, the people who it affects and who need to engage in community programs that will help us to reduce our emissions and realistically address our issues with health and the climate change. Our sports are passionately followed, and our sports personalities take on the mantle of heroes, of role models. We therefore need to be able to engage our sporting communities, populations, fraternity, to contribute to the ways in which we can communicate the effects of climate change and what we need to do. Some of us in the Caribbean are members of the Commonwealth, and through the Commonwealth, we engage with the Commonwealth Department for Sport and Development and Peace in programs such as Commonwealth Moves to address the non-communicable diseases. The sports fraternity act as enablers, they act as motivators to help us to follow the programs that we have set and the goals we set for ourselves. We need to ensure that we have a line of communication that is realistic to the ordinary grassroots of the Caribbean, and therefore that we can engage in a meaningful manner that will help us to engage in all the different programs. And so, and Jonathan had a nice slide with all the things that we need to do. We need to see how we can get our sports fraternity to become enablers. And we must engage with these icons to lead and motivate us as the community. Lead by example and by advocacy. I trust that we can combine all our efforts, and with much of what Daphne, Lisa, and Jonathan have put before us today, and we've heard from other experts before in this program, and let us make sure that we have a realistic plan for addressing the effects of climate change on the health of the nations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Derek, for providing that perspective. I think, absolutely we need to be firing on all cylinders here. And I really appreciate the discussion, the highlighting the importance of really trusted sources, right? And role models who can not just, have credibility when speaking about this issue, but really have broad reach to a variety of different audiences. And so I think that's really critical. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a lot of questions here. I wish we had a whole nother hour just for the Q&A. But in the interest of efficiency, I think I'll start with just a question really to the whole panel here. And going back to some of the results in Jonathan's survey, one of the things I was really struck by is, in particular, the low levels of awareness regarding specific populations that are most at risk for the harmful health effects of climate change. And I'd just be curious from each of your perspectives to get a sense of how you think we might be able to address those low levels of awareness and bring those numbers up from each of the different areas you work in.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think as you saw on the slide, I mean, people were generally aware of, children, pregnancies, things like that have always been of concern in environmental health circles. But yeah, I was surprised too that with immigrants and the indigenous, with storms that we've seen, hurricanes that have heavily affected those populations, that they wouldn't be higher. I mean, I think one thing we can do is, with the presentation that Ari gave, really is to highlight, what are the connections between climate change and the fundamental food sources for some of these populations, how that's affecting them, how women are being affected, how they're being driven off, their land because of climate change. And so I think, as Lisa and others and Daphne has mentioned, I think the human interest stories are going to be really powerful to increase that level of awareness. And as I said before, I think doing some of the work that we're promoting at the national level to determine who really are these populations and what are their needs and how are they likely to be affected will be important too.
Yeah, I want to stress on that as well. And I think something that Lisa said really stood out for me was the importance of human emotion in creating understanding and creating action is so critical. And as Jonathan said, human interest stories are so key to that, as are influencers actually, because by telling stories of others or by putting a celebrity that we look up to in the public eye and telling stories, we are getting to a very raw place within the public. And that's where we can connect with people.
I totally agree. I mean, I think human interest stories don't always have to be just a publication. I mean, we all love to read a good story, but we can also take clips from those stories. So I think what we need to do is we need to go to these populations, share their stories, and then it goes back to, again, what we're seeing. We're not really seeing these stories in the media. So we do have to do some work with the media so that these stories are out there. So I wasn't really that surprised as Jonathan was, because we're not seeing it. It's not being reflected. So I wasn't surprised when I saw that people didn't make the connection in that way. But we know what we have to do. I mean, COVID has made it so difficult to go and tell those stories, right? But we're trying as hard as we can, making sure we have people on the ground doing more training so that we can get these stories.
May I think we need to really have two levels of conversations when we talk about greenhouse emissions and reducing the carbon, etc. That's one conversation that virtually has nothing to do with the average citizen. And they just look at it and think, well, those big companies can ruin our earth, it doesn't matter. We need to have another conversation that says, okay, if you want to address obesity, you need exercise. Let's do that. If you need to clean up your beaches, etc., we need to have community exercises, go out and do that. If we need to replant crops to ensure that there's a balance between, food and feeding back oxygen and taking away carbon dioxide in there, we need to do that on a community level. And I think we need to appreciate that there needs to be two different conversations, but leading to the same goal. Just my take.
Yeah, thank you for that. We actually just have a few more minutes left here. Unfortunately, I'm going to ask more of these questions that are really to the whole panel, just in the interest of allowing everyone to have a chance to speak. Thinking forward in terms of the agenda after this conference, in terms of the interest in developing a research and action agenda, I'd be really curious to hear from each of you, either sort of what do you see as the biggest challenge from your perspective? What is the biggest challenge for you moving forward in terms of communicating about climate change and health in the Caribbean? And how might, if there was one research question that you could ask social scientists to work on that might help your, advance your work, what might that be?
I would love to see more work done around the mental health impacts of climate change within the region. I was so impressed by the piece that I mentioned earlier that came out of this project from PAHO. From the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. They did such a great job. And I would love to see further analysis on this area and learn more about it. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of challenges, my own research for me made me realize what I wasn't doing right. And so coming from this, I am going to make more of an effort to make that connection in a more user-friendly way, because there absolutely are two separate types of audiences. I totally agree with that. And definitely coming into the discussion from a health-related perspective, I think, is a more approachable way.
I would
just a few seconds.
I would say quickly, I would like somebody to take this research that we did and drill a little deeper. I wish we could have some focus groups with specific areas to find out, okay, so you're not looking at social media. What are you looking at? How long should a story be? I would like to see it go a bit deeper. I mean, for me and for us, to me, the most difficult thing, my biggest challenge right now is COVID. It's consuming everyone, it's consuming our resources, it's consuming our time, and it's almost, I was going to say, Daphne, I think a lot of those stories in that time period may have been because of COVID. So it would be great to track those outside of COVID times to see if it had an impact on that. If COVID would just go away, we could probably talk about other things more. So that's my main challenge.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the main things very quickly is what's really positive of this work is that there are countries like the Bahamas that are now applying it at the national level. to really drill down and see what's going on with some of these issues at the national level with vulnerable populations, with immigrants, and how can we address it. So I think that's a very positive side of using some of this work at the national level and applying it.
Derek, I'll give you the last word.
Oh, that's dangerous. But no, seriously, I think there is so much to be done. In the immediate future, our problems are COVID, health-related, mental health, etc. related, just survival. But there are so many things that have happened during the lockdowns and COVID that are positive, that we should learn from and see whether we could not advance while COVID is going on. Some of the research, marine, the marine biology under the sea, how does that affect what we are doing on Earth? And, you know, there really are so many opportunities, but my message would be really to keep the communication simple with our communities, because if we don't buy in to whatever is happening on a world level, it's not going to work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a terrific note to end on. And I think, you know, we should, moving forward, we should be thinking about ways to harness some of the increased salience of things like the need to act collectively as a community that has really become heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to thank all of our panelists here, as well as everyone else who joined us for this session today. We look forward to seeing you at the next session in just a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.